Let's talk money now. Personal finance expert Mary Holm is here. Hi, Mary.
Hi, Jesse.
What are we talking about this week?
Well, before I tell you that, there's a couple of things I just need to remember.
Yeah.
One was that last time I said we were going to talk about scams, and then instead we talked about being because I was caught without any communications for a while
it was
after
a great
the
session,
cyclone.
actually.
Yeah, well, it certainly wasn't anything to do with finance. and at the time I said, I will do scams next time and plan to today. But then I saw that the Fraud Film Festival is on in Auckland.
Oh, yeah.
At the Q Theatre in Auckland on March the 30th and 29th. And I thought a couple of years ago I went to that festival and it was they've got really interesting films
It's
on.
a funny thing to have a film festival on fraud.
It is. They're docos mostly, or nearly all, about different really successful frauds. Or, I mean, in the end they got discovered. They're intriguing. So I decided, I'm going to go to that festival and then report back on that to you on my March 30th session. And so doing fraud and scams are kind of so overlapping. So we're skipping scams this time.
Yeah, some people might suggest that your promise to do scams as a topic is a bit of a scam in itself, Mary.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, not good behaviour. Not good behaviour. And the other thing I just wanted to quickly say too is that next Wednesday, which is International Women's Day, at noon, I'm going to be on a panellists in a discussion on women's financial well-being, and people can watch it live at the time or later on if they want to, and the links to it are on my website, maryholm.com.
Great.
So if you look at the homepage there, people might be interested in watching that one.
Oh, there'll be some nervous corporate PRs ahead of International Women's Day. For a while there, you'd get in trouble if you ignored it, and then now corporates kind of try and address it and talk about it, and if they get it wrong, they get in trouble, and it can be very sort of thin ice.
Oh, yeah. Some people are hypersensitive, aren't they? And I think, if a company's trying, we've got to give them.
I think it was. We
benefit.
shouldn't bring it up again, but I think New Zealand Rugby had a bit of a bad International Women's Day last year.
Did they?
For thanking women for being supportive of the male players.
Oh.
And a few people pointed out that maybe they could have mentioned the Black Ferns. Anyway.
Yeah, given what's happened since with Black Ferns. Yeah. But today, I read a rather interesting paper by a man called Matthew Arnold, and I thought that's a familiar name, and he's a Scottish, I think, poet. But this Matthew Arnold works for Russell Investments New Zealand, and he's come up with quite an interesting paper on two issues around KiwiSaver. One of them is basically looking at whether KiwiSaver default members are getting a bad deal.
Oh, yeah.
And the other issue is how everybody in KiwiSaver, default or otherwise, can really tell how well their KiwiSaver fund is doing. So looking first of all at the default members, now we've got about nearly 3.2 million people in KiwiSaver now, which is pretty phenomenal in a population of five-ish. And about 1 in 10 of those are in default schemes, which a few years back it was 1 in 6. So they're gradually getting people out of default schemes, and that has been a bit of a goal because default is the scheme the fund you get put into if you join KiwiSaver when you get a new job but don't specify what provider and what fund you want to be with, you get put in the default fund. And Matthew Arnold reckons that people in default funds might be getting a rather bad deal. And it's particularly worrying because these are people who are probably not very financially savvy, and they've just landed in there and they say, okay, this is cool, and don't do anything more about it. And so we don't really want to be giving them a bad deal as they're going through.
As I recall, if you'd asked this question 5 years ago, the answer would have been very quick. Yes, they are getting a bad deal because the default funds, they didn't tend to think about them quite so hard.
That's true. Before we go any further, I should say they're still getting a darn good deal because KiwiSaver is so good.
Yeah.
These are pretty much all employees who are in the default funds, and so they're getting money from the government and from their employer going into their KiwiSaver fund, and so because of that, it's still a very good investment. But nonetheless, could we be doing better for them? And what happened in December 2021 is there were some quite big changes in default funds. They changed it to 6 providers, quite a few of them quite new providers.
Responding in part to some calls that you'd been making over the years, Mary.
Well,
I don't know about directly responding, but they did some of the things that you suggested.
Possibly, yes, yeah. Let's just say that they one of the big changes was they changed from conservative funds to balanced funds, so these sort of average risk funds, because they found a lot of people, especially a lot of younger people who were getting into the default funds, were in conservative funds, and that means they would, if they just sat there and did nothing about it, they'd retire with a lot less because they're not taking enough risk over the long term.
Yeah.
So they moved them into these averagely risky funds called balanced funds, and they also reduced the fees on them. But this Russell Investments paper had a look and said, well, how have the funds been doing since this change in December 2021? Now, it's not really fair because last year was a particularly bad year for all investments in shares and bonds, which is very unusual. And these KiwiSaver funds are half shares and half bonds. And so the best return last year in the default funds was minus 7.8 in the Smart Shares Fund, and the worst was minus 12.6 in the Simplicity Fund. And as was pointed out in the paper, that meant that if you started in December 2021 with $9,000, which was about the average balance in the default funds, you would already be $450 worse off if you were in the fund with the worst performance than in the fund with the best performance. And so they're saying this is not a good deal, that the investments, the way the different providers are working their funds can be quite different and the results can be quite different. They also pointed out that the fees range from 0.2% in Smart Shares, which is a low KiwiSaver fee, to 0.4% in Westpac, which is still low, but it's twice as high as the one in Smart Shares. And just a quote from the paper, the guy says, over decades, such variations may result in some default members being thousands of dollars worse off than other members simply because they were randomly stuck in the wrong fund. And so, so it's not very good for these people who are just being randomly put into a fund and don't do anything about it. Some of them to end up way worse off than others. That's the point. That's not
You could argue that as long as they are lower than the average fees across all KiwiSaver funds, that it probably makes sense.
Yep.
It's
still, I would have quite liked the government to have said, okay, you've all got to charge the same fee. We'll agree on a fee that you can all charge. And if you want to be a default provider, this is the fee you've got to charge.
Interesting.
And that would have been one way to do it.
Yeah.
But and the suggested solution has been to let any provider at all offer a default fund, but they've all got to have the same low fee and they've got to be passively managed, i.e. like index funds where that's all very simple.
Sorry, this is the suggestion of the person writing the paper.
Yes, yes. And that would mean everyone will get pretty much the same result who's in a default fund. And I think that's fair, really. It's not really fair for one person to do a lot better than another when they're all just
because
random.
Presumably if say there's 4 default funds, presumably if 4 people are put into them, it just goes 1, 2, 3, 4 randomly.
Yes.
Yeah, so you should get the same result as the person next to you.
Yeah, you should really, shouldn't you? Yeah. Yes, there's inland revenue that I think that allocates you to whichever fund you're going to go to. So I thought that was an interesting point to make. The second main point of the paper was about benchmarks, which is what funds, KiwiSaver funds have to publish a benchmark, which is how they measure their own performance in a given period. It might be 6 months or it might be 10 years, but they've got to say, we got an average return of 5% and the benchmark was an average of 5.5% or something like that. And at the moment, each provider makes up their own benchmark it's supposed to be based on the types of investments they're making. So how many shares, they've got how many international shares versus New Zealand shares, how many bonds, that sort of allocation. So they've got, so when you get your KiwiSaver results for a year or whatever, that it'll have a benchmark there that says your fund got this and the benchmark is this. Usually the funds do worse than the benchmark, actually, partly because the funds have to report after fees and the benchmarks don't include fees, but they should still be roughly the same as their benchmark. And it's become a bit of a mess where providers, they have to say how they came up with their benchmark. And here's another quote, Matthew Arnold says about this situation. He said, KiwiSaver benchmarks have evolved to the extent that most are a hodgepodge of often unrecognisable underlying fund benchmarks, inaccessible, meaningless, uninvestable constructs, providing little in the way of relevant information for the millions of KiwiSaver members. In other words, he's just saying they don't really work. I should just quickly say here, the reason we have benchmarks anyway is because otherwise when a KiwiSaver fund like these results I gave you before for the last year were very bad. But you shouldn't be looking at just how well your fund's been doing. You should be looking at how well it's doing relative to the market. Because if the whole share market's gone down and your fund doesn't go down so much, that's pretty good. So you shouldn't, and the same thing if your fund reports a really good positive performance, if in fact the benchmark did even better, which says the markets in general did better than you, then you should be unhappy. So it's kind of giving you a proper fence post to compare with.
Yeah, so the idea is every fund has to state what their benchmark is.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
what their target is really, I suppose.
Yes, that's probably a good way of putting it, really.
I'm just having a look at my latest statement. I can't see one. Is it generally easy to find?
It should be, but I don't know, off the bat what every provider does. They should be pretty easy to find. But I think that's part of the point of the paper, that even if you can find the information on it, it's kind of a bit hard to make sense of it. And so people are struggling. Now, one of the points of the paper too is how to compare your provider's performance with other providers' performances. And some benchmarks are probably sort of kinder than other ones that have been, set up by the... So it's very hard. You can go on Sorted and have a look at the Smart Investor tool, and there you can get comparisons of the different growth funds' performance or the different balanced funds' performances, but it's not always a totally fair comparison, that. So what has been proposed here is that the FMA or MB or somebody come up with just 5 benchmarks, one for all conservative KiwiSaver funds, one for moderate, one for balanced, one for growth, and one for aggressive. And everybody's got to use those, and they're going to be made up from just bonds and share indexes. So they're quite simple.
Would you do them retrospectively? Because you couldn't really have a target for a share fund, could you? Because who knows what the world is doing?
Yeah. Well, yes, when you said target before, come to think of it, it isn't. When I think about it some more, it's not really a target because it's having a look backwards at how well your fund did and how well the benchmark did. Yes, so then you can... Now, there's 3 possible objections to this that I thought up. One is if you've got an ethical or socially responsible fund, they tend to compare themselves with a benchmark. There are indexes out there that are ethical indexes, if you will, and they compare them with that. And Matthew Arnold's arguing that's not really that great an idea. People who are in an ethical fund or a socially responsible fund or whatever you like to call it are probably interested in knowing how well they would do against all investments, not just ethical investments. And in fact, in the last year or so, the ethical ones have actually done worse than the market as a whole. But that's not always the case. But I think he's right. I think that, you choose to go into one of those funds, but you'd quite like to just see how well your fund's performing against all the others. Funds, a big problem with having just one benchmark is some of the funds within, say, growth funds are much riskier than others, and they've got more shares, fewer bonds, let's say. And so they might say, well, in some years when the share markets aren't doing so well, we're going to do worse than the benchmark, and in other years we're going to do better than the benchmark. I think that's up to the providers to explain that, those people.
That's okay.
Yes.
Like, as long as I know that,
Yes.
hey, I'm a couple of percent below the benchmark, but I've chosen this slightly more volatile fund.
Yeah.
Same with ethical,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Hey, the benchmark's 7%, I got 5%, but I've chosen that I'm going to maybe give up on some profits for
certainly
the better world.
Yes, and over the future, you aren't necessarily going to do worse in an ethical fund. I should hasten to add. I mean, so there's certainly periods where they've done better than average. So I think it's up to the providers to then explain to their investors why lately we've been doing worse than the benchmark. And over the years, people can watch how those explanations are going. One other possible problem is that some of the KiwiSaver funds invest in property or small businesses, or there's one that invests in cryptocurrency. There's all kinds of things. And the proposed benchmark would be only shares and bonds. But once again, I think, okay, the provider can say, hey, we're actually half commercial property, and that's had a particularly bad year, or it's had a particularly good year. Up to them to explain why they're doing different from the sort of basic idea. So I just reckon it's pretty good, actually, these ideas.
People can read them in their own time?
Yeah, and I made a tiny URL. So if you want to have a look at the report, if you look at tinyurl.com/Russell KiwiSaver, you can read the report on it.
Mary Holm.